The True History of Anthony Frier by Arthur Gray and read by Christopher Halton. The world, it is said, knows nothing of its greatest men. In our Cambridge microcosm, it may be doubted whether we are better informed concerning some of the departed great ones who once walked the confines of our colleges. Which of us has heard of Anthony Frier of Jesus? History is dumb respecting him. Yet but for the unhappy event recorded in this unadorned chronicle, his fame might have stood with that of Bacon of Trinity or Harvey of Caius, and they lived to be old men. Frier died before he was 30. His work unfinished, his fame unknown, even to his contemporaries. So meagre is the record of his life's work that it is contained in a few bare notices in the college bursar's books, in the grace books which date his matriculation and degrees, and in the entry of his burial in the register of All Saints Parish. These simple annals I have ventured to supplement with details of a more or less hypothetical character which will serve to show what humanity lost by his early death. Readers will be able to judge for themselves the degree of care which I have taken not to import into the story anything which may savour of the improbable or romantic. Anthony Frier matriculated in the year 1541 to 1542, his age being then probably 15 or 16. He took his BA degree in 1545, his MA in 1548. He became a fellow about the end of 1547 and died in the summer of 1551. Such are the documentary facts relating to him. Dr. Reston was master of the college during the whole of his tenure of a fellowship and died in the same year as Frier. The chamber which Frier occupied as a fellow was on the first floor of the staircase at the west end of the chapel. The staircase has since been absorbed in the master's lodge, but the doorway through which it was approached from the cloister may still be seen. At the time when Frier lived there, the nave of the chapel was used as a parish church, and his windows overlooked the graveyard, then called Jesus Churchyard, which is now a part of the master's garden. Frier was of course a priest, as were nearly all the fellows in his day, but I do not gather that he was a theologian or complied more than formally with the obligation of his orders. He came to Cambridge when the 6 Articles and the suppression of the monasteries were of fresh and burning import. He became a fellow in the harsh Protestant days of Protector Somerset, and in all his time the master and the fellows were in scarcely disavowed sympathy with the rites and beliefs of the old religion. Yet in the battle of creeds I imagine that he took no part and no interest. I should suppose that he was a somewhat solitary man, an insatiable student of nature, and that his sympathies with humanity were starved by his absorption in the new science which dawned on Cambridge at the Reformation. When I say that he was an alchemist, do not suppose that in the middle of the 16th century the name of alchemy carried with it any associations with credulity or imposture. It was a real science and a subject of university study then, as its godchildren, physics and chemistry, are now. If the aims of its professors were transcendental, its methods were genuinely based on research. Frier was no visionary, but a man of sense, hard and practical. To the study of alchemy he was drawn by no hopes of gain, not even of fame, and still less by any desire to benefit mankind. He was actuated solely by an unquenchable passion for enquiry, a passion sterilizing to all other feeling. To the somnambulisms of the less scientific disciples of his school, such as the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, he showed himself a chill agnostic. All his thought and energies were concentrated on the discovery of the magisterium, the master cure of all human ailments. For 4 years in his laboratory in the cloister he had toiled at this pursuit. More than once, when it had seemed most near, it had eluded his grasp. More than once he had been tempted to abandon it as a mystery insoluble. In the summer of 1551, the discovery waited at his door. He was sure, certain of success, which only experiment could prove, and with the certainty arose a new passion in his heart, to make the name of Ffryer glorious in the healing profession as that of Galen or Hippocrates. In a few days, even within a few hours, the fame of his discovery would go out into all the world. The summer of 1551 was a sad time in Cambridge. It was marked by a more than usually fatal outbreak of the epidemic called the sweat, when, as Fuller says, patients ended or mended in 24 hours. It had smouldered some time in the town before it appeared with sudden and dreadful violence in Jesus College. The first to go was little Gregory Grange, schoolboy and chorister, who was lodged in the college school in the outer court. He was barely 13 years old and known by sight to Anthony Frier. He died on July 31st and was buried the same day in Jesus' churchyard. The service for his burial was held in the chapel and at night, as was customary in those days. Funerals in college were no uncommon events in the 16th century, but in the death of the poor child among strangers there was something to move even the cold heart of Ffryer, and not the pity of it only impressed him. The dim chapel, the master and fellows obscurely ranged in their stalls and shrouded in their hoods, the long-drawn miserable chanting and the childish trebles of the boys who had been Gregory's fellows struck a chill into him, which was not to be shaken off. 3 days passed and another chorister died. The college gates were barred and guarded, and except by a selected messenger, communication with the town was cut off. The precaution was unavailing, and the boys' usher, Mr. Stevenson, died on August 5th. One of the junior fellows, sustainer, Sir being the equivalent of B.A., followed on August 7th. The master, Dr. Reston, died the next day. A gaunt, severe man was Dr. Reston, whom his fellows feared. The death of a Master of Arts on August 9th for a time completed the melancholy list. Before this, the frightened fellows had taken action. The scholars were dismissed to their homes on August 6th. Some of the fellows abandoned the college at the same time. The rest, a terrified conclave, met on August 8th and decreed that the college should be closed until the pestilence should have abated. Until that time it was to be occupied by a certain Robert Laycock, who was a college servant, and his only communication with the outside world was to be through his son, who lived in Jesus Lane. The decree was perhaps the result of the master's death, for he was not present at the meeting. Goodman Laycock, as he was commonly called, might have been the sole tenant of the college, but for the unalterable decision of Ffryer to remain there. At all hazards his research, now on the eve of realization, must proceed. Without the aid of his laboratory in college, it would miserably hang fire. Besides, he had an absolute assurance of his own immunity if the experiment answered his confident expectations, and his fancy was elated with the thought of standing like another Aaron between the living and the dead, and staying the pestilence with the potent magisterium. Until then he would bar his door even against Laycock, and his supplies of food should be left on the staircase landing. Solitude for him was neither unfamiliar nor terrible. So for 3 days Ffryer and Laycock inhabited the cloister, solitary and separate. For 3 days, in the absorption of his research, Ffryer forgot fear, forgot the pestilence-stricken world beyond the gate, almost forgot to consume the daily dole of food laid outside his door. August 12th was the day, so fateful to humanity, when his labours were to be crowned with victory. Before midnight, the secret of the magisterium would be solved. Evening began to close in before he could begin the experiment which was to be his last. It must of a necessity be a labour of some hours, and before it began he bethought him that he had not tasted food since early morning. He unbarred his door and looked for the expected portion. It was not there. Vexed at the remissness of Laycock, he waited for a while and listened for his approaching footsteps. At last he took courage and descended to the cloister. He called for Laycock but heard no response. He resolved to go as far as the buttery door and knock. Laycock lived and slept in the buttery. At the buttery door he beat and cried on Laycock, but in answer he heard only the sound of scurrying rats. He went to the window by the hatch where he knew that the old man's bed lay, and called to him again. Still there was silence. At last he resolved to force himself through the unglazed window and take what food he could find. In the deep gloom within he stumbled and almost fell over a low object, which he made out to be a truckle bed. There was light enough from the window to distinguish, stretched upon it, the form of Goodman Laycock, stark and dead. Sickened and alarmed, Ffryer hurried back to his chamber. More than ever he must hasten the great experiment. When it was ended, his danger would be past, and he could go out into the town to call the buriers for the old man. With trembling hands he lit the brazier which he used for his experiments, laid it on his hearth and placed thereon the alembic which was to distill the magisterium. Then he sat down to wait. Gradually the darkness thickened, and the sole illuminant of the chamber was the wavering flame of the brazier. He felt feverish and possessed with a nameless uneasiness, which, for all his assurance, he was glad to construe as fear. Better that than sickness. In the college and the town without was a deathly silence, stirred only by the sweltering of the distilment, and as the hours struck by the beating of the chapel clock, last wound by Laycock. It was as though the dead man spoke, but the repetition of the hours told him that the time of his emancipation was drawing close. Whether he slept, I do not know. He was aroused to vivid consciousness by the clock sounding 1. The time when his experiment should have ended was 10, and he started up with a horrible fear that it had been ruined by his neglect. But it was not so. The fire burnt, the liquid simmered quietly, and so far all was well. Again the college bell boomed a solitary stroke, then a pause and another. He opened, or seemed to open, his door and listened. Again the knell was repeated. His mind went back to the night when he had attended the obsequies of the boy chorister. This must be a funeral tolling. For whom? He thought with a shudder of the dead man in the buttery. He groped his way cautiously down the stairs. It was a still, windless night, and the cloister was dark as death. Arrived at the further side of the court, he turned towards the chapel. Its panes were faintly lighted from within. The door stood open, and he entered. In the place familiar to him at the chancel door, one candle flickered on a bracket. Close to it, his face cast in deep shade by the light from behind, stood the ringer, in a gown of black, silent and absorbed in his melancholy task. Fear had almost given way to wonder in the heart of Ffryer, and as he passed the sombre figure on his way to the chancel door, he looked him resolutely in the face. The ringer was Goodman Laycock. Ffryer passed into the choir and quietly made his way to his accustomed stall. 4 candles burnt in the central walk about a figure laid on trestles and draped in a pall of black. 2 choristers, one on either side, stood by it. In the dimness he could distinguish 4 figures erect in the stalls on either side of the chapel. Their faces were concealed by their hoods, but in the tall form which occupied the master's seat, it was not difficult to recognize Dr. Reston. The bells ceased and the service began. With some faint wonder, Ffryer noted that it was the prescribed Roman Mass for the dead. The solemn introit was uttered in the tones of Reston, and in the deep responses of the nearest cowled figure he recognized the voice of Stevenson, the usher. None of the mourners seemed to notice Ffryer's presence. The dreary ceremony drew to a close. The 4 occupants of the stalls descended and gathered round the palled figure in the aisle. With a mechanical impulse, devoid of fear or curiosity, and with a half prescience of what he should see, Anthony Frier drew near and uncovered the dead man's face. He saw himself. At the same moment the last wailing notes of the office for the dead broke from the band of mourners, and one by one the choristers extinguished the 4 tapers. "Requiem aeternam dona ei, Domine," chanted the hooded 4, and one candle went out. "Et lux perpetua luciate," was the shrill response of the 2 choristers, and a second was extinguished. "Cum sanctis tuis in aeternum," answered the 4, and one taper only remained. The master threw back his hood and turned his dreadful eyes straight upon the living Anthony Frier. He threw his hand across the bier and held him tight. "Cras tu eris mecum," he muttered, as if in antiphonal reply to the dirge chanters. With a hiss and a sputter the last candle expired. The hiss and the sputter and a sudden sense of gloom recalled Frier to the waking world. Alas for labouring science! Alas for the fame of Frier! Alas for humanity dying and doomed to die! The vessel containing the wonderful brew which should have redeemed the world had fallen over and dislodged its contents on the fire below. An accident reparable, surely, within a few hours, but not by Anthony Frier. How the night passed with him no mortal can tell. All that is known further of him is written in the register of All Saints' Parish. If you can discover the ancient volume containing the records of the year 1551, and I am not positive that it now exists, you will find it written: Die Augusti 13, burials in Jesus churchyard, Goodman Laycock, Anthony Frier of your sickness. Whether he really died of the sweat, I cannot say, but that the living man was sung to his grave by the dead, who were his sole companions in Jesus College on the night of August 12, 1551, is as certain and indisputable as any other of the facts which are here set forth in the history of Anthony Frier. The end.